To implement the read-only domain controller, I'm going to pull up Active Directory users and computers on my machine. In Active Directory users and computers, I'm going to say I want this read-only domain controller to be in the Toronto location. So in Toronto, I'm going to create a new group. I'm going to call this group Toronto Admins. So if you are in IT, you're an administrator in Toronto, your user account is simply going to be a member of this group. Now, the Microsoft best practice to create a read-only domain controller account is to pre-stage the account, meaning I'm going to create the account first, then I'm going to join the computer to the domain, make it a read-only domain controller. To pre-stage, you have to right-click the domain controller's OU, and there is an option to pre-create a read-only domain controller account. If you right-click the domain or any other OU, this will not be an option. Has to be the domain controller's OU. When I click that, it gives me a mini configuration wizard to walk through. So in the wizard, I'm already using administrative credentials. So my logged on credentials, RTS networking / administrator, I'm going to use my existing. So I'm just going to click next. Well, now it says, what do you want to name the computer? I'm going to name it TOR for Toronto -RODC. So Toronto Read Only Domain Controller. And we'll just choose next for that. It's going to make sure that computer name is unique. I'm going to leave it in my one site, the default first site name. So I'm going to click next for that. No changes can be made there. As I said earlier, a read-only domain controller can be a DNS server, but if it hosts an Active Directory integrated zone, that too will be read-only, and it can also be a global catalog server. So I'm going to click next for that, leaving both of those selected. This is the unique part of this. Delegation of RODC installation and administration. Whoever I choose here, user or group, will have full administrative rights over the read-only domain controller. That's unique. There is no local administrators on a full domain controller. So right now I'm on a full domain controller, my RTS DC1. So I'm going to leave this window here for a moment, but I'm going to go to computer management. So I'm going to right click on start and select computer management. Notice that on the domain controller itself, there is no local users and groups on a full domain controller, meaning it's not possible for a full domain controller to have someone be a local administrator. You would have to be a member of an Active Directory group, and that's going to apply to all computers. The unique part about the read-only domain controller is I can single out a read-only domain controller, and I can say you are an administrator only on this one read-only domain controller. An example of that, I'm going to leave this window here for one moment. I'm just going to switch to another virtual machine. I'm going to go to my RTS Serve 1, and I'm going to log into this machine. Now, this is just a member server in the domain. It's not a read-only domain controller. It's not a full domain controller, just a member server. If I go to computer management on any other server, you'll notice when it opens, we will have local users and groups. When my domain controller was promoted from a member server to be a domain controller, it actually removed the local users and groups, and they were moved into Active Directory into a container name built in. So I'm going to now switch back to my domain controller. So what I'm going to say for this read-only is that I want the group we just created, the Toronto admins. I'm going to choose Toronto admins. I want that group to be local administrators on this read-only. Now, the point of this is very likely in your branch office where you're deploying the read-only domain controller, it may be a file server, a print server. It may have some other function. And I may need this group of admins to be able to manage files, print settings on it, so they may very well require administrative rights. The fact that this is a read-only domain controller means they have no write access to Active Directory. They cannot edit any of my objects. So from that point of view, there's no security concern at an Active Directory level. So I'm going to leave that Toronto admins there and just click Next. And we would be done with the pre-staging. When I click Next here and Finish, now in my Domain Controllers OU, I have this Toronto RODC read-only domain controller account is pre-staged. Now, 2 groups in Active Directory to facilitate this. If I click on the users container at the bottom here, I have a group named Allowed RODC Password Replication. If you are a member of this group, your credentials will be replicated to every read-only domain controller I ever deploy. By default, this group has no members in it. If I open that. So if I go to the Members tab, there's no one in it. Microsoft recommends that a best practice, we do not add members to this group. The downside to this group, if you deploy one read-only domain controller and you add all the users that need to be replicated to this in Toronto, next month you may add another read-only domain controller. This group would have its membership replicated to all your read-only domain controllers. So we do not intend to use this group, although it exists. The other group is Denied RODC Password Replication Group. If you are a member of this group, your account can never be replicated to a read-only domain controller. This has several members already. So when I go to the properties of the group and look at the Members tab, you'll see there are sensitive accounts already here. If you are a member of the Domain Admins group, Enterprise Admins, Schema Admins, never will your credentials be replicated to this read-only domain controller. So if I have my own IT groups I've created, I would simply click Add, and I would add them to this group as well. Because keep in mind, the point of this was we had limited physical security, so we were deploying a read-only domain controller for that reason. Now, let's tie this to a scenario, and then we'll finish this configuration. On my map here, I'm going to draw a location in Toronto, and I have my location in New York City. I'm going to say New York City is headquarters. So in New York City, I have 2 domain controllers. Now, these are full domain controllers. I intend to deploy a read-only domain controller in Toronto. Toronto has 200 users that work there. So my implementation of this would be, in New York City, on one of my full domain controllers, I'm going to create a group, and I'm going to name that group Toronto Users. If you are a member of this Toronto Users group, I want your account to be replicated to this read-only domain controller, but only if you are a member of that group. I can also do the same for computers. So I could have a group named Toronto Computers. All the computer accounts in Toronto could be a member of that group, and they would also replicate. So that's our partial read-only domain controller would only have accounts that we designate. So let's set this up. Back on my full domain controller, I'm going to go to Toronto, and I'm going to create a new group, and I'm going to name that group Toronto Users. And I'm going to create another group named Toronto Computers. So if your user count's in the Toronto OU, we would make you a member of the users group. If your computer is in Toronto, we make your computer account a member of the Toronto Computers. Well, when I go back to my domain controllers OU, and I find this Toronto read-only domain controller account. When I go to the properties of this account, there is a password replication policy that exists. When I click on this password replication policy, I can see right now no one gets replicated to this because account operators, administrators, server operators, that denied RODC password replication group, they're all set to deny. The only group set to allow is that Allowed RODC Password Replication Group, which if you remember, there were no members of that group. So at the moment, no accounts, no credentials are replicated to my read-only domain controller. What I'm going to do is click Add. I'm going to select Allow Passwords for the accounts to replicate to this RODC. I'm going to click OK. And I'm just going to type T and check names. So that'll filter, but I'm going to add my Toronto users and my Toronto computers groups. So I'm just going to hold down Control and select both of those and OK. And OK again. Now I have my Toronto groups are both allowed to replicate. Well, when I click OK for that, that is all that's required. Now at the next replication cycle, those accounts will be replicated to my read-only domain controller account. The benefit to this, if this account is ever compromised in any way, a backup is stolen of this account, the server itself, we believe, may be stolen or somehow has been compromised, I can simply right-click, delete. When I delete the read-only domain controller account, it says, are you sure you want to delete it? I'm going to say yes. It says if the read-only domain controller was stolen or compromised, it is recommended that you reset the passwords of the accounts that were stored on this read-only domain controller. So this assumes the reason I'm deleting the account is because it may have been compromised. Now, at first, that may seem like a drastic step to delete the account. That is the correct step. In one shot, I can say reset all passwords for user accounts that were cached on this read-only domain controller. Keep in mind, I'm doing this from my full domain controller. Those 200 user accounts we talked about would all have their passwords reset. So now if that database is compromised containing their credentials, it would be useless. Those credentials would no longer authenticate to anything. Now, it does give us a warning saying this will require users to contact the help desk to get a new password because it will still have to be reset. That's checked by default. Not checked by default, reset all passwords for computer accounts that were cached on this. Now, we would put a lot of thought into this. The computer account authenticates to Active Directory in a similar fashion to a user account. Computers have passwords. Those passwords are negotiated every 30 days and changed in that every 30-day cycle. Every time your computer powers up in the domain, it authenticates with that password against a domain controller. If I want to have the computer passwords reset, I can select this. The trade-off would be all the computers would be disjoined from the domain. Someone would have to go to every computer and rejoin it back to the domain. Now, many environments would believe that may be a bridge too far. They don't have a need to do that. They just may be concerned about user account passwords. I can also export a list of all the accounts that were cached. This list would be useful if I wanted to email this to the help desk to say, all these passwords need to be reset. So they can kind of get a head start and wait for users to call to have their new password. Now, I'm going to deselect export the list because those groups I added had no user, so there'd be nothing in the list. But if I just click delete, it gives me a warning saying you do understand you're about to reset passwords for users cached and they have to contact the help desk. Now, not security related, but it also deletes all the metadata for this read-only domain controller account, meaning there's nothing I have to do when I'm done. It would automatically delete records from DNS. It would automatically delete the replication link, so there's no cleanup I would have to do after this. But I'll say okay, and it comes back and says, this is also a global catalog. Are you sure you want to delete it? I'm going to say yes, and that account is deleted. All those passwords have been reset. Now those users can't log in until they call the help desk, but it completely mitigates the security concerns we would have. Now here, I know all I did was pre-create the read-only domain controller account. I didn't go through the process of actually installing the domain controller. If you're taking this course, you're probably somewhat comfortable with the basics of Active Directory. I do have a dedicated course to Active Directory that walks through all the configurations of Active Directory. Now, I'm not trying to upsell you or tell you to go take that course, but if you were to install Active Directory, one of the options going through the install would be to have your domain controller be a read-only domain controller. So through the Active Directory install, you would have just selected that option, and it would have made your install a read-only domain controller. So that's really the easy part. The big part of this was pre-creating the account and managing the password replication policies.